Most people, if you talk to them, they'll say two things. They'll say, well, gout's caused by your diet. I mean, you've probably seen these old images of the big overweight king with his foot up on a pillow with a big red toe, and he's sitting there with a steak and a glass of port. And it's that image that implies that actually it's the patient's fault and that they are doing this to themselves.
Well, James, welcome to the show. This is Power to the Patients. I'm Brandon Lee. I'm your host, and I'm joined today by James Mackay. He is the co-founder and CEO of Crystalys Therapeutics. Prior to Crystalys, he got the first novel mechanism approved for gout in 50 years. Now with Crystalys, he is continuing to build on that original mission of serving gout patients. James, I've been so looking forward to having this conversation. Welcome to the show.
No, likewise, Brandon. Thanks for having me on the show.
Now, for the audience at home, maybe if you could just start by giving me a quick sketch of your career and how you ended up working in this space.
Sure. So originally from Scotland, you can probably tell from my accent. Scientist by training, degree in genetics, PhD in medical genetics, did a postdoctoral fellowship in Canada, and then decided after that maybe I should step into industry. So I joined the CRO world for a couple of years, and then I joined what at the time was Imperial Chemical Industries, or ICI, which was the predecessor company to AstraZeneca. And that was the start of a 30-year career there. 10 years in the agrochemical, industrial chemical business. So I wasn't always a life science guy. And then 20 years in life science, split between the US and the UK. And then the last 13 years or so has been biotech across three different companies: Ardea Biosciences, Aristea Therapeutics, and now Crystalys Therapeutics.
Yeah. Now, I'm too curious not to ask here. You've seen the journey of AstraZeneca before it's AstraZeneca, then the kind of scale by which that company was built, and then today you're sitting in biotech land again. What has drawn you back to the earliest days?
Well, no, I was always big pharma first. So really 30 years in big pharma, and then graduated into biotech. And, what I would say is great career in big pharma, really taught me everything that I need now in order to be the CEO of biotech.
Yeah. Well, let's jump into that. Before I get to Crystalys, I want to start with Zurampic. I mentioned in the introduction, you had the first novel mechanism approved in 50 years. But my understanding is that it didn't quite land commercially in the way that you might have hoped. Can you maybe walk me through the kind of journey there and the lessons learned?
Yeah, sure. So I led the AstraZeneca business development team that acquired Ardea Biosciences that were developing Zurampic. A molecule had just started phase 3 clinical trials when we acquired the company. And the AstraZeneca board asked me to come to San Diego, where I'm still based now, to take over the CEO role, and did that for 5 years. So took the molecule all the way through phase 3, the readout, through the regulatory submission and the approval. We always knew that Zurampic had the potential to have a renal tox liability, and we tried to manage that by combining it with another drug, allopurinol. When we completed the phase 3 trials and they basically read out, we saw that renal tox profile, but really only at the higher dose, the 400 milligram dose. The lower dose that we tested, 200 milligrams, had a renal profile similar to the comparator arm in the study. And as a result of that, we actually only sought approval for that lower dose. And the FDA and the European authorities and many other countries around the world agreed with that. I think the challenge commercially, however, was that obviously because we were at a lower dose level than originally intended, the efficacy, the effect of the drug was less than we'd anticipated it was going to be. And even though the 200 milligram dose had an acceptable renal profile, the FDA put a box warning on the prescribing information because of what had happened at the higher dose level. And that just became very challenging in the PCP space where this drug was being prescribed, and ultimately resulted in it not being particularly successful, hence the reason that we're back at it again.
Talk to me about the internal discussions, I guess, during that time. You had, kind of come in via the AstraZeneca partnership. And then when you were, I guess, facing this reality of, hey, needing to kind of navigate the potential tox requirements, I'm curious, how are you and the team thinking about taking another swing at this versus maybe going back to the mothership, so to speak, and starting work in another area?
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, drug development is a challenging business. What's most important is that you do the right things for the patients. and think about the benefit risk of the molecule that you're developing. Hence the reason that we never ever asked the FDA to approve the 400 milligram dose for Zurampic, because we considered that the benefit risk profile was not acceptable. So at the end of the day, it's all about patients, doing the right thing for the patients. If you do that, then I think ultimately you'll be successful. I think, after 30 years in big pharma, where, as you say, fantastic training ground, really taught me everything I know. But at this stage in my career, biotech, small companies, my current company is 14 employees. That's very different from the 4,000 clinical staff that I used to be responsible for at AstraZeneca. But you can make a big difference in both these environments. Just at my stage in my career, biotech is the place for me.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to shift gears a little bit to the Crystalys story then. I'm curious, what did you see that gave you enough conviction to go down this path with Crystalys?
Yeah, so the little bit of a connection to the previous company. So I previously co-founded and was CEO of Crystalys Therapeutics. There was a clinical stage immunology-focused biotech. That molecule that we were developing there for rheumatology and dermatology conditions had an unexpected liver tox issue, which resulted in us closing that program because the benefit risk was not acceptable. And we closed the company down and gave the remaining money back to the investors. And once the dust had settled a little bit, our lead investor there, Novo Ventures, came back to me and said, look, we didn't work out the way we all hoped, but we really like the way that you managed the whole issue, and we'd like to work with you and the team again. And in the meantime, we've become very interested in the gout space, and you and your team have got, probably more gout drug development experience than most people on the planet from your time at Ardea, and have, been successful in getting gout drugs approved before. So they approached us and said, would you be interested in, working together to see if we can find a molecule that, you believe is worthy of development and that we believe is worthy of investing in. So we decided to do that together with them. So we went out, did a landscape search of all the molecules in development, and we identified this molecule, dotinurad, that we're now working on. In parallel with that, we also were introduced to another venture capital firm called Catalyst Pacific, who in parallel with us, they specialize in identifying Japanese assets that have been approved in Japan, but the rights are available in the US and Europe. And in parallel, they had identified dotinurad, and we met up while we were doing our diligence, and we decided to combine forces together. So with a management team, Novo Holdings and Catalyst Pacific created the company together, and then went and acquired the asset, and then went and raised the money to fund the development.
And my understanding is that the safety data looks pretty strikingly different with dotinurad. Can you tell me a little bit more about what allows it to have such a different kind of safety profile?
Yeah, so you probably won't be surprised, given what I told you at the beginning about Zurampic and the renal tox profile, that was one of a short list of criteria that we needed to find a molecule that didn't have that renal tox liability. It needed to be something differentiated. And when we came across dotinurad, it was a rather unique situation because the molecule had been developed by a small Japanese pharma, Fuji Yakuhin, and actually approved in Japan in 2020. And so it's been on the market 5 to 6 years there. Over 2.2 million patients have received the drug. So a really enormous safety database. And in both the clinical trial program in Japan, it's also now approved in China. So there's a clinical trial program in China. In both of those clinical trial programs, there was no evidence of excess renal tox with dotinurad. And then, of course, we now have 2.2 million patients who have received the drug since approval with really no renal tox signal. So very different from the Zurampic molecule that we worked on before. And the reason for that is really the half-life and the PK profile, and probably also the selectivity to the URAT1 transporter. So both Zurampic and dotinurad are the same mechanism of action. They inhibit the URAT1 transporter and make you basically excrete more uric acid. The issue with Zurampic was that it had a relatively short half-life and had most of its activity within the first 6 hours or so after dosing. So it caused a spike of uric acid in the proximal tubule of the kidney over a short period of time. And in certain circumstances, that resulted in the uric acid crystallizing and actually causing the acute kidney injury. Ditinurad is very different. Ditinurad has a longer half-life, 12 to 14 hours, and has a very smooth pharmacokinetic profile over that period of time. So there are no spikes of uric acid excretion. So it's very smooth over that 12 to 14 hour period. So avoiding the issue that we had with Zurampic. The other thing is that Ditinurad is highly selective to the URAT1 transporter, whereas Zurampic was a little bit of a dirty molecule in the sense that it, as well as hitting URAT1, it also hit 3-ABCG2. These are all other renal transporters that transport uric acid. So the uric acid excretion with that molecule was a little bit uncontrolled, whereas with Ditinurad, it's much more controlled. And we believe that that's the reason that we're not seeing any renal tox liability with this molecule.
I guess, what factors led to it, I guess, sitting on the shelf in Japan for so long without somebody taking action? It kind of feels like the data was kind of there for the taking.
Yeah, so first of all, Fuji Yakein are a very small Japanese pharma company. I think this is one of only 2 approved molecules that they have. They're primarily generics pharmacy type company, and they have no capabilities outside of Japan. So they really only focused in Japan, and they've relied on partners elsewhere in the world. So they licensed out the rights in China and several other Asian countries to Eisai, and Eisai have got approval in those countries now. And they originally licensed out the North American and European rights to a US company called Uric Therapeutics that's a subsidiary of Fortress Bio. So they did that in 2020 or 2021. And Uric did some work. They did a phase 1 healthy volunteer study. They did a phase 1b gout patient study. But they really struggled to raise enough money to actually develop the molecule, probably because the design of their phase 3 program that they were planning was probably not optimal. And our experience in developing gout drugs, we were able to bring a different development approach to the table. And, you know, when we approached Urica and Fortress Bio, after multiple discussions, they agreed that the molecule would be better in our hands than in theirs. So we did an asset purchase of their license that they had with Fuji back in July 2024, and then took control of the molecule. So the molecule was there and it was being developed, but just slower than it would have been had someone else had their hands on it earlier.
Yeah, gotcha. The strategy was clear, but for a variety of different reasons, it was harder to bring into clinic here in the US than expected.
That's absolutely correct. Yeah.
Yeah, makes total sense. I'd love for you to maybe shift gears a little bit and talk to me about the patient journey and the patient perspective here. If I'm a gout patient or someone I know is a gout patient, what does Crystalys bring to the table now that maybe wasn't previously available through standard of care?
Yeah, so maybe let me talk a little bit about the gout patient journey. So, or maybe even talk a little bit about gout as a disease. The biology here is relatively simple. Gout is caused by excess uric acid in the body that can result from either or both the overproduction of uric acid, which tends to be linked to diet, or the under-excretion of uric acid. And what's important is that 85 to 90% of patients that develop gout develop it because they can't excrete enough uric acid. And what happens is so that the uric acid level rises in the body, that eventually it causes a patient to have a flare. It's a sudden, intense attack of pain and inflammation, normally in the joint, either the hands or the feet. Very debilitating. Patient often will end up in the emergency room because they think they've broken a bone or something. So obviously a very expensive way for a patient to be treated. And patients that are untreated, they'll suffer multiple flares per year. And as the disease remains uncontrolled, they will start to deposit uric acid on their joints and indeed elsewhere in the body as well. And that results in local inflammation being caused, and then ultimately the buildup of what are called tophi, which are like big nodules of uric acid on the joints. The standard of care today is allopurinol. That's a xanthine oxidase inhibitor. It stops the production of uric acid. So it's linked to the amount of uric acid, the amount of purines that the body is consuming. And it's a relatively effective molecule if used correctly. It can get about 50% of patients to below target serum uric acid levels, which is 6 mg per deciliter. And if a patient can get below 6 mg per deciliter, then they stop crystallizing the uric acid and their disease will become under control. The problem is that 13 or 14 million gout patients in the US, at least half of those patients are not controlled today. They're often undertreated by primary care physicians. These patients often have lots of comorbid conditions. They have diabetes, hypertension, metabolic syndrome, and they often get treated ahead of the gout being treated. The patient care for gout patients is really not that good, primarily because there really haven't been any new medicines come to the market. As you indicated, Zurampic was the first new mechanism of action to come to the market in 50 years. And unfortunately, that ultimately was not successful, but that's what really left us wanting to come back into this space, because we felt that these gout patients were really undertreated and really needed new therapeutic options that allow them to get this disease under control and significantly improve the quality of their life.
So it sounds like, let's say, for about half of patients, there are kind of like reasonable solutions. Is the vision that Crystalys would be able to support the other half of patients? Or how do you think about like the non-responders and the applicability of this asset?
That's exactly where we're wanting to position this. We're not trying to compete with allopurinol, or there's also a second xanthine oxidase inhibitor called febuxostat. We clearly see those as first-line treatment options. They're both generic drugs. They're inexpensive. It's appropriate that they should be used first. The problem is that for the patients who are not controlled on those drugs, there really is nothing else, except for the most severe gout patients who, about 6,000 of them a year, receive a drug called Crystalys, which was originally a Horizon Therapeutics drug, is now an Amgen drug. Very effective uricase, but it's an IV infusion, and it's very expensive. So it's somewhat challenging to use, so only really reserved for the most severe patients. And there are millions of patients who are essentially have no other treatment options today. And that's where we're trying to position Detinurat.
What is it about the mechanism of action that you think allows it to offer a solution to this other half of patients where allopurinol doesn't?
So it comes back to basically the root cause of the disease. So as I indicated earlier, 85 to 90% of patients that develop gout develop it because their body can't excrete enough uric acid. And our molecule blocks the URAT1 transporter in the kidney, which is responsible for reabsorbing uric acid into the body. So basically, we make people pee out more uric acid. So it's similar to the type of approach used with, diabetes treatments such as SGLT2 inhibitors that basically make you pee out more sugar. It's basically the same approach. You're blocking a transporter, and that allows the body to excrete. So this mechanism of action is directly applicable to the root cause of the disease, which is why we think that this is going to make a big difference to gout patients once we complete the clinical trials and get the drug on the market.
Are you at liberty to talk yet about the state of the programs and how you're expecting timelines to play out?
Yeah, happy to. So after we acquired the molecule, we went to the FDA, had an end of phase 2 meeting, which is the standard meeting ahead of phase 3. We got agreement to the phase 3 program. We're doing 2 main phase 3 studies, one focused on reducing gout flare and one focused on resolving tophi. So we're focusing in on the clinical symptoms that make a big difference for the patients and the physicians. We raised our initial set of financing, which was a $205 million Series A financing back in September last year. I think was the largest, if not one of the largest, private Series A financings in the US last year. And we started the clinical trials at basically the same time in September. We'll complete the recruitment into the clinical trials later on this year and then see data from the clinical trials, towards the end of 2027, early 2028. And that's going to be an exciting time for us, an exciting time for patients in terms of potentially trying to bring a new medicine to help these patients that are desperately in need of additional treatment options.
Incredibly exciting. Why do you think the domain of gout has maybe remained under-targeted for so long?
I think gout patients, honestly, the level of treatment that they receive is extremely poor. And I think a lot of that stems back to misunderstanding the disease. Most people, if you talk to them, they'll say 2 things. They'll say, well, gout's caused by your diet. Probably seen these old images of the big overweight king with his foot up on a pillow with a big red toe, and he's sitting there with a steak and a glass of port. And it's that image that implies that actually it's the patient's fault and that they are doing this to themselves. Now, obviously, having a good diet and having these things in moderation is a good thing for gout patients, as it is for all of us. But that's not the root cause of the disease. So, that myth has persevered over decades. And I think that's resulted in patients not receiving a level of treatment that they should have done. And in fact, maybe not even demanding the level of treatment that they should get. Then I think that's been combined, Brandon, with the fact that for whatever reason, there's not been much innovation in this space for really the last 60 or 70 years. And the standard of care that's used today is the same standard of care that was used 60 years ago. And what we're trying to do is to bring a new mechanism of action into play here that, is much more effective in reducing uric acid levels and ultimately improving the symptoms of gout. And that really, we believe, will transform the way that gout patients are treated. And often when physicians get new medicines that can make a big difference, they start prescribing those medicines more. They start paying more attention to the patients because they can actually do something about this. And we often hear from rheumatologists that they don't like to treat gout patients. The reason they don't like to treat them is they don't really have anything to give them. And that's not a very satisfying situation for either the physician or the patient. And we aim to change that by bringing different treatment option to the table here that allows the prescribing physician, whether that be the PCP or in our case, we're focusing on rheumatologists, will allow them to really make a difference in the way that these patients are actually treated.
Was there something specific about gout that drew you back in for maybe this kind of second swing at it? I imagine that at the point of incorporation, you probably could have gone in a few different directions, but you chose to come back to gout. So tell me about that.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So I was my stage in my career after we closed Aristea. It was a moment for reflection. Do I step back into an operating role again? Do I maybe do more consultancy? Do I sit on a number of boards? Try and help younger people in their career by mentoring them. So that whole thought process went through, and I think when Novo Ventures contacted me and said they wanted to work together again, and the minute they mentioned gout, I'm like, well, this is unfinished business for us. We set out to develop a molecule that we felt was going to transform the way that patients were treated. And that molecule, unfortunately, just did not have the right profile to do that. But my team and I had learned so much about that, about how to develop a drug, and we brought all those learnings back in. I remember when I went to talk to some of the key team members and we sat down, are we going to do this again, right? Because the Zurampic journey was a challenging journey because that molecule had some issues that we needed to address. But we'd all learned so much that these gout patients desperately needed additional treatment options that this made perfect sense for us to go back into the space. And I remember I was at home when I took the call from Novo Ventures, and my wife obviously overheard the call and heard me talking about gout again. And she and I had been talking about, do I take another CEO role or do I do something else? And as I walked into the room, she said, I know you need to do this. So it was obvious to her as well that this was something that I needed to do, and it was really unfinished business. So we're really looking forward to bringing a new treatment option to patients. And previously at Ardea, we'd developed excellent relationships with all the gout key opinion leader experts. And when we came back into this space, it was very gratifying to be like welcomed home to family again. It's a relatively small expert community, and they were delighted that we'd come back in to the space because even though ultimately Zurampic was not successful, I remember when we closed down Ardea, one of the gout key opinion leaders, Michael Becker, wrote me a lovely handwritten letter that said, James, you and your team at Ardea have done more for gout patients than anybody I know in my career. And that was really gratifying. And we knew this was unfinished business. We hadn't completed what we wanted to do. So hence the reason that we decided to get back in here. So it's kind of personal for all of us. When we've brought many of the Ardea Biosciences team back together again in order to design these trials and execute on them.
Yeah. I mean, an incredible way to kind of bookend the mission here.
Yeah, and I think it's also the one final thing that I'll say is that I believe my father had gout. He never ever talked about it. It was only after he passed away that I found his medication, which indicated to me that he had gout. And he'd always had some occasional problems of not being able to walk properly, or, it was obviously he was having a flare and having problems. And I always remember that the family used to blame it on his diet. And, once I got to understand gout, I realized it wasn't his fault. It was likely that he couldn't excrete the uric acid, and then it was building up in his body and causing him a lot of pain. But he suffered in silence because everybody round about him thought that this was a diet-related issue, right? Probably his doctor thought it was a diet-related issue. So really, it's kind of a personal thing for me that if we can help other gout patients understand that it's not their fault that they have this disease, and we can provide them with a drug that is going to target the root cause of the disease and ultimately make them better, then this is going to be very gratifying to do this.
What do you now know about doing clinical trials in gout that you wish you had known when you first started?
I think it's about understanding and knowing how poorly these patients are treated to begin with, and being able to select patients that have had appropriate treatment and have failed, because those are the patients that, we really should be treating here. And it's really just understanding the course of the disease as well, is that these patients have had this disease for years, sometimes even decades, and that they've built up over that period of time a pretty large reservoir of uric acid in their bodies that's causing localized inflammation, not only in the joints, but also in other tissues. So, for example, the uric acid deposits in the cardiovascular system as well. And there was a really nice publication from Professor Abhishek's group at Nottingham University in the UK a few months ago, where they did a big database study and followed patients who either had controlled uric acid or uncontrolled uric acid for a period, I think, of 5 years. And those with uncontrolled uric acid had far higher cardiovascular issues than those that had controlled. So that's an area that I think is going to be worthy of investigation later on once we get approval for the drug. And I do often think as well, my father died from a massive heart attack. I do often wonder whether that was actually linked back to the uric acid deposits in his body and the fact that that wasn't effectively treated. So I think we've learned a lot about the course of the disease, how patients should be treated and how patients are treated. And that, I think, is and what's important for the patients. And I think that's helped us to design a phase 3 program that's going to be very relevant to the patients and the physicians once this drug gets approved.
Can you maybe share one or two design decisions, very intentional design decisions that you've chosen to do differently here?
Yeah, so in particular, probably the two areas that I'd flag is one is the length of treatment. Most gout clinical trials are 12 months long, and that's because the FDA needs 12 months of safety data as part of the approval process. But based on our experience at Ardea developing Zurampic, we knew that if you really wanted to really impact the clinical symptoms of the disease rather than just reduce your uric acid lab value, then you needed to treat patients for longer than 12 months. And that's because these patients have built up this big uric acid reservoir over years and decades. And although you can reduce uric acid quickly, it actually takes months and months and months for that uric acid reservoir to be depleted and excreted from the body. So we decided, rather than do the 12-month treatment period, which most other, probably all other gout drug clinical trials have done, we decided to treat for between 15 and 18 months in our 2 clinical trials in order to really maximize the symptom improvement that these patients would experience. And then the second area is that I think is important is that we decided that we could have done a placebo-controlled study, although doing a placebo-controlled study for 15 to 18 months is probably not the best thing to do. What we decided to do is to do an active comparator study. So we're taking patients who are already on allopurinol and then randomizing them to either continue their allopurinol dose, so they're getting standard of care, or they stop taking their allopurinol and get detinurat. And that's really a real world study, because those are exactly the patients that are sitting in front of the physician when the physician's making a prescribing decision. So I think that was a very important decision for us and will be very important once we get into the commercial phase here and the willingness of physicians to prescribe. I think the data that we're going to generate is going to be very relatable to the patient with gout that's sitting opposite them when they're making a prescribing decision.
If you don't mind me challenging just ever so gently here, you mentioned that half of the patients who try allopurinol don't get a response. Would those patients then be disqualified from being able to participate in this because they're not actively taking allopurinol?
In our clinical trial, everybody has to be on a stable dose of allopurinol as they come into the trial. And that is likely the patient population that the FDA and the European authorities will put in the prescribing information. But that may encourage physicians to put their patients back on allopurinol, see if they can be controlled. If they can, that's great. If they can't, then they would be eligible to take tertinurat.
I guess like my naive outside-in expectation would have been that maybe you might have chosen to go after the patients who had an incomplete response to allopurinol instead as a way to kind of define the kind of target group.
Well, in a way it is. It's people who have taken allopurinol but are not controlled. So their disease is still active. They're still symptomatic. They're still having flares, right?
They're on a stable dose, but it's not controlled.
Correct.
Absolutely. I see.
Yeah. And the reason that they remain on that stable dose, even though they're not controlled, is that basically there's nothing else for the physician to give them. So
of course,
it's better to at least have something that's at least reducing your uric acid some way, even though you're not getting it completely under control and under target.
Yeah, makes total sense. So I like this broader theme of kind of lessons picked up along the way. I want to maybe take an even further step back across your career. Big pharma, 3 biotechs. What do you know now about running a biotech that's maybe you wish you knew when you first started getting into it?
13 years ago, when I first stepped into a biotech, I knew nothing about how to run a biotech. And, suddenly you go from big pharma where you have an army of people around you to the first biotech that I founded. There were 4 of us in the company to begin with. So you're doing everything yourself. Now, that's very positive and motivating, right? Because every single action that you take of every minute of every day is directly related to what you're doing in trying to move that biotech forward. So that's very empowering and satisfying. But you do need to surround yourself by experts in different fields, right? So we have a lot of consultants that work with us at the previous company, also at this company. The current company is still small. It's 14 people, and we're running 2 phase 3 trials, 2 phase 2 trials. It's a lot of work, but you can get an amazing amount of work done if you have the right people in the company, talented drug developers that understand how to design and then operationalize clinical trials. So yeah, I always say to people, I never say a bad word about my 30-year career at AstraZeneca. It was a fantastic training environment. I learned so much. I got so much opportunity to move across different areas within the business, really opened my mind to what was possible. And that really equipped me to move into the biotech environment and lead and create biotechs here and persuade people to invest a lot of money in what we're doing. At the end of the day, we're not spending Crystalys Therapeutics money, we're spending our investors' money. And it's really important that we do that in a very fiscally responsible way and that we deliver on what we said we were going to deliver to those investors. And that's the essence of fundable drug development in the biotech space.
Was it scary making that first decision to leave big pharma into biotech when you're first tapped on the shoulder to do it?
Strangely not, because I had a transition period after AstraZeneca acquired Ardea Biosciences and the board asked me to go and take the CEO role. It was kind of like a halfway house, or maybe not quite a halfway house, in that Ardea was being run still as an independent organization. So really all I needed to do was to agree the budget once a year with AstraZeneca, and then everything else was my responsibility. So it was a great transition time. When I decided to leave AstraZeneca, it just felt it was the right time. 30 years with the company, the last 5 years in biotech, it didn't seem sensible for me to go back into the big organization. So I thought I would miss it a lot, I didn't miss it at all in the end, but that's probably just because I was ready and stepping into create Aristea Therapeutics first and now Crystalys Therapeutics. I mean, creating a biotech and building the team and getting the funding in order to develop a new medicine is one of the best jobs that you can ever have.
Well, James, I want to thank you for sharing your story and coming on the show with us today. I know the work you're doing is incredibly important for the gout community, and I know you're a busy man, so I appreciate you taking the time for this conversation.
Yeah, no problem at all. If your patients with gout are watching this and they're interested, go to our website, www.crystallystx.com, and you'll find the details of what we're doing there.
Absolutely. Well, again, James, thanks again for taking the time. I so appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure, Brandon. Very nice to talk with you.